What role, if any, does the university play in the moral formation of its students? We are joined today by 3 scholars, an interdisciplinary panel, conversation partners really, who will help us to think more deeply about virtue, moral formation, and the university. Dr. Sarah Schnitker is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Baylor University. She has published more than 75 peer-reviewed articles and edited chapters and has procured more than $10 million in funding as a principal investigator on multiple research grants, including the Developing Character in College Communities grant that is co-sponsoring this event and the conference of which this is a part. Jonathan Brant, to her right, is the Dean for Research and Culture at Wycliffe Hall at the University of Oxford. He has co-edited Cultivating Virtue in the University and co-authored several articles in the Journal of Moral Education, Journal of Character Education, and International Journal of Ethics Education. He is Dean for Research and Culture and the Director of the Renaissance Project. And he's also Associate Fellow with the Oxford Character Project, where from 2014 to 2023, he served as the founding director. And finally, John W. Boyer is Senior Advisor to the President and Martin A. Ryerson Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of History. He served as Dean of the College from 1992 through June of 2023, gaining the informal status of Dean Emeritus now. He is author of several books, including The University of Chicago, A History and Culture and Political Crisis in Vienna, Christian Socialism in Power, 1897 to 1918. So this will be an informal conversation. I'll have a few questions for our guests, and then hopefully we'll have time before our 6 p.m. curfew for questions from the audience. So Dean Boyer, or rather John Boyer, my apologies. My first question is for you. In your magisterial tome on the history of the University of Chicago, you've traced its development and renewals across various presidents. Can you give us a sense in terms of, as a case study, this one university, its position on the role of moral formation of its students? Does it follow this thesis that Reuben discusses about the modern university relinquishing its role in the moral formation of its students?
Okay, well, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Okay, thank you. I thought I would just say briefly a little bit about the history of our university, because it is a kind of a test case for some larger issues in the development of higher education in the 19th and 20th century more generally. The short story, if you don't want to read the 700-page book, which is actually available in the bookstore, there's a new edition for, I think, $35 or something like that. But the short version of it is that there were actually 2 universities of Chicago. There was one founded with that name by the Baptists. Were given some land down on 31st Street by Stephen A. Douglas, the Illinois senator who debated Lincoln over slavery and freedom. It was a small kind of frontier college, but Roger Geiger, the eminent historian of American higher education, would call a multi-purpose college or a multifunctional college. A couple hundred students, initially male, eventually allowed women to come. Had basically a liberal arts curriculum, an old classical curriculum with some additional subjects, including agriculture. It lasted until about 1885 and then went bankrupt. And basically, as Geiger puts it in one of the things that he's written, the great cities were like the death knell of small colleges. The great cities killed off small colleges, and that was certainly the case in our situation. Our university was then refounded a few years later with the support of John D. Rockefeller by many of the same Baptists, but on very different terms. Instead of a college, they decided they wanted to have a research university that copying, or at least imagining a German model, a little bit of Oxford, a little bit of the Sorbonne thrown in, a little bit of Cambridge, but mainly Berlin, Leipzig, Vienna, Göttingen, Bonn, kind of plopped down in the middle of the prairies in the middle of the United States. Now, the two sides of the story are kind of relevant because the first college was nominally a denominational college, and we know that of the 400-odd colleges, institutions were called colleges in the United States around 1890, almost 3/4 of them were founded by a religious denomination. Congregationalists, Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, other largely Protestant, a few Catholic, largely Protestant. And many of these institutions had as their mission the religious education of their students, although we know, in contrast to Julie Reuben's book, which is an excellent book, which is more of a kind of intellectual history, if you look at the social history of what was actually going on in many of these colleges, I think Geiger puts it well, is that there was only probably a small minority of students who took the religious instruction seriously. They were there for other purposes, very functional purposes, to get some kind of what was called mental discipline or character formation being kind of like how to be a gentleman or a gentlewoman, not necessarily to be religious or devotional or pietistic in any formal way. And that world basically collapses or dissipates as these colleges begin to fail on the one hand, and as they're absorbed into this new system of research universities, which is created in the late 19th century, beginning with Hopkins and Clark and Stanford and Chicago, and then the other older developed colleges in the East Coast changed from being four-year colleges into research universities, in which the already, in Geiger's argument, and this has been made by other scholars, rather tenuous notion of religious and devotional cultivation of students was certainly changed radically by taking students and putting them in a very large urban setting. This was not a residential college. Most of our students until the 1940s lived at home or lived in the neighborhood. You didn't have this kind of fellow feeling, group formation of any kind. People coming, they were basically, it was a streetcar college. People came and went to get a job, get some skills. And at the same time, the college is playing a different role than it played in the 19th century because it is now a kind of preparatory for graduate education. Most people who studied medicine and law or business in the 19th century didn't go to college, but by the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, if you want to go to law school or medical school or get into a graduate program, you have to have a four-year college degree. And so the college has become part of this new system, highly secularized, highly differentiated, and in many cases highly urbanized, in which the fate of students is now cast. And so I think it's this structural, short structural history is important because you use the word moral and religious in the same sentence. Now those may be rather different notions. And what Geiger and other historians would argue is that even the religious colleges, the denominational colleges, especially the male colleges, there's a gender differentiation, which is really quite fascinating in terms of the way women were educated in these colleges as opposed to men in the 19th century in regard to religion and piety. But if you just take the men's colleges, Geiger would argue that, in a sense, the battle that Julie Reuben wants to see lost by 1900 is already being lost by 1860 in some ways. So it's and this is probably subject to more research. So that may frame the conversation a little bit. And what's fascinating about Chicago is that we tried to start a small liberal arts college, really a denominational college, and it failed. And it was reborn by a devout Baptist, John D. Rockefeller, who thought he was being talked into creating a second denominational college, but our founder, William Rainey Harper, had very different ideas. And there is the story that in the early documents about our founding, they would talk about a Baptist university, but Rockefeller insisted that the university not be subject to his own philanthropy. He wanted other people to give. And what the Baptists quickly found is that among themselves there was very little wealth. They had to go to the Congregationalists, they had to go to the Methodists. The people in Northwestern didn't like that, but they went up there and to the other Protestant sects. And then eventually they ended up down at the Jewish Merchants Club. And the Jewish merchants saying, excuse me, like, you're a Baptist university? Like, okay, well, thank you very much. No, we're a secular university. And so there is this change of rhetoric that happens over the course of the 1890s, which is really quite stunning in terms of our own history. So maybe that's good for starters.
That's great for starters. Yeah, could you trace out a little more for us in terms of the sort of secular university? Does that mean over the course of those early years, the university saw itself as relinquishing this role of moral formation, or a shifting of perspective from a more explicitly religious one to a moral formation not founded on religion?
I guess we'd have to define our terms in terms of what we mean by moral formation, and is that the same as religious instruction or religious practice? The university never, in line with its formal statement that it was a secular university, in fact denied that it kept the religious affiliation of entering students. But actually they did. I found this evidence in the archives, and they were watching very carefully. We know that, for example, by the 1930s, a very large section of our undergraduate population were Jewish students whom we accepted because we didn't have, and this could be a statement of our virtue or a statement of necessity. We couldn't afford not to admit Jewish students, whereas some of the Ivies were deeply prejudiced against Jews. The kind of missing element within the city of Chicago from our student population were Catholic students, not Jewish students. So we were still a heavily Protestant Jewish university. Now, in the 19-teens and 1920s, many people, not all people, still went to church. I mean, it was a conventional thing that one did as part of the social culture. That explains why there are so many churches in Hyde Park and synagogues to which you could walk. Now, does that mean that we were self-consciously teaching moral formation? I would be hard put to suggest that most of the faculty thought that's what they were doing, because they were hired to be distinguished scholars, trained in disciplinary methodologies. Their promotions, their professional success depended upon that. The way in which they dealt with undergraduates was basically as many graduate students. And one of the Harper's insight was if you wanted to have a successful doctoral program, you need to kind of train your own. So they actually treated the undergraduates as if they were kind of mini graduate students. And so if one were to define moral formation as tolerance, as open-mindedness, as willingness to view different points of view, of course those are traditional and venerable and very important scholarly virtues. And so I think certainly our students would have been trained in those ways. But I don't think the faculty themselves saw their job in any way as being a kind of proxy for religious instruction at all.
Right. And so then fast forwarding, you have the distinguished role of not just being a steward of University of Chicago's history, but also a steward of its own students for 31 years as dean of the college. And setting aside moral formation as a proxy for religious formation, but maybe attending more explicitly to the development of character or the development of virtues within your own role as dean, where did you see the role of the colleges, the role of the houses, the role of the much now larger university than that earlier university with folks living within their homes in terms of the formation of the virtues of students?
Yeah, I think one can answer that in many different ways. So let me just give you one rather somewhat narrow, but I think very powerful answer or example. And that is that many of the students who go to the great private universities of the United States come from families with some means. And one of the things we were able to do here, and many of our peer institutions have been doing, and I know some of the top British universities have been doing as well, is to try to kind of even the playing field. You can use whatever image you want, but create stronger patterns of social mobility. And one of the things that's particularly gratifying is to have students come from very disadvantaged educational backgrounds, come to a great university and learn those scholarly skills, because in a sense, to develop maybe not a moral personality, but an intellectual personality. And I would argue that there are features of that also have to do with which have moral overtones. And I think to the extent that the American higher education system has become much more open to not just simply talking about, but actually acting upon and delivering upon upward social mobility for students from all classes, particularly the inner city and rural youth. That has been a very powerful change, certainly in my lifetime at the university.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan, turning to you, you've been a bit of an institution builder yourself with this work with the Oxford Character Project. I mean, for those who aren't familiar with it, first could you give us a little history behind it, its mission, and how it's trying to respond to a particular problem that it identified, that you helped identify at Oxford?
Absolutely. First of all, I should say this is rather a gear change, and certainly a change of scale, because we're moving from a major research university and somebody who's had an incredibly important leadership role within that to a very small project that is about 10 years old, the Oxford Character Project. But what I will start out by saying is that I can sort of date and place quite precisely when I first thought, goodness, something quite unusual, quite remarkable is happening here. And it was in 2015, it was the second year of the project, and it was the stage when we were receiving and assessing applications for a cohort we called the Global Leadership Initiative, which was open to graduate students at the university of any or no religious faith, any or no religious background, but who were interested in leadership and the role of personal character, of personal qualities within leadership. And in 2015, I sat down with, I think, 70 applications in front of me for 12 places on this program. And in the first 3 applications that I read, there were 2 absolutely outstanding women postgraduate students. Both, this is incidental, but both were elite athletes. One had actually competed on behalf of her nation. Both were in receipt of immensely prestigious scholarships. One was a Rhodes Scholar. One had been the first woman to hold officer rank in a particular sort of branch of her country's military. And one was a medic and had just returned from leading Oxford University's rapid response unit, who'd gone out to Central Africa where there had been an Ebola outbreak. 2 utterly remarkable young women who were keen to be on this project, to be thinking about how could they be formed in their character, in virtues, whether or not they'd use that language, in order to lead well and have, a greater positive impact in the world when they went out from Oxford. And we were only able to offer a place to one of those 2 women. And I thought, this is not what I would have expected. And it was particularly unexpected because the project had been set up by a small Christian chaplaincy that had been working with postgraduate, what we call postgraduate graduate students at the university for a number of years. And we had realized that these major research universities essentially act as pumps. They suck in wonderful young people from all around the world. They hold them for a period of time, and then they pump them back out into the world. And so we were thinking, what could we offer to these students whilst they were with us in Oxford that would help them not just in their academic, credentials and skills and expertise, but, as people who, many of whom would end up in positions of great influence and responsibility. And that is what led us to begin thinking about, okay, what can we offer these students in the sense of a program, a cohort, a community, where they can engage in the intentional cultivation of virtue. And one of the academics who helped us in the formation of the project put it this way: it's simply an empirical fact, it's simply an obvious truth that these major research universities train thinkers and they train leaders. What is less obviously true is that they invest in ensuring that those are wise thinkers and good leaders. And so it's not from lack of desire, I think, but simply from an uncertainty about the role of a research university working with adults. And so we created this project to try and offer something into that space, into that gap. And it began with 2 cohorts each year, which were for people of professed Christian faith, and they would meet together thinking about either if they were heading into careers in academia or into service in other areas, what were the sorts of virtues that they would want to develop to help them to flourish and to be effective in those roles. And then this third stream of activity, the Global Leadership Initiative, that was open to people of any or no religious faith, but wanting to address those same kinds of questions. What is the kind of person that I need to be in order to be able to affect the kind of change in the world that I want to see? And I think really that was the beginning. And so all of those cohorts continue to run to this day. The 2 Christian cohorts continue to run under the umbrella of the chaplaincy in Oxford, whilst the sort of open, what we might think of more plural program, is currently housed within the university in the Department of Politics and International Relations.
Jonathan, I think for several folks, hearing about a pluralistic or a secular virtue or character formation program might sound foreign. Could you parse out a little more how you made that translation from a Christian-oriented program, one tied to that meta-identity as the researchers' language they were using, to one that is unmoored from a specific religious identity?
Yeah, so as I'm sure many of you will know, within academia, within sort of philosophy, moral philosophy, there was a return in the mid sort of 20th century to considering, a third kind of ethical approach, virtue ethics, so a sort of agent-centered, person-centered way of thinking about ethics. And actually, some philosophers in Oxford, Elizabeth Anscombe in particular, Philippa Foot, others, were very influential in that return to considering virtue ethics. And so the first thing which is really useful is that actually it does have sort of academic credibility, academic standing within the university. Not everybody knows about it or cares about it, but if you were to look into what a philosophy faculty is teaching, that would almost certainly be included. So that's helpful. But it also means that you have a tradition that runs, certainly from Aristotle through to the present day, that at different times, is more or less closely interwoven with the Christian faith. But you can certainly pick up both on that kind of classical neo-Aristotelian tradition and, find within that, certain tools and ways of speaking about virtue and ethics and the cultivation which are hugely useful. And obviously in our contemporary context, you also have the remarkable work of psychologists, particularly perhaps sort of those involved in positive psychology, who also provide you with another entire kind of discourse that you can draw upon, which I think has a huge amount of overlap, with this kind of virtue tradition and our understandings of how we develop good character.
Thank you. Sarah, turning to you, I know that this is a whole field of research for you. I could have lots of questions. So instead, I just invite you to comment on how your work has sort of honed in on specific virtues and the way in which, I just know that your work has honed in on virtues, and your methodology both allows for a broader look, but also attention to how this functions at the individual level. Can you comment on your work on the type of formation or perhaps the character formation that you see within the university level, both at Christian and at non-Christian universities?
Yeah. No, and if you don't mind,
I don't.
I also, hearing your comments, I think it's interesting. I was sitting here reflecting on a bit of the history within psychology as a rather young field on the study of character and virtue, and how it was really integral to our initial work at the turn of the 20th century when psychology was really founded. That it wasn't the study of personality, it was character and personality was our main journal in understanding humans, and how it was really an essential feature of moral character, not just this kind of morally neutral personality, which then became the predominant way of studying the human person. So I think it's fascinating to look at, and also for the study of religion. It was William James, American psychology founder, was deeply interested in people's religious experiences and religious formation and how that relates to their character development. And then for much of the 20th century, I think it's a challenging thing to study, and so we abandoned it and really, this is too hard. But right, with positive psychology, there was a turn back to this and to say we really must look at the moral components and not just do kind of devalued character as personality, but actually engage this aspect of how do we create good people and not just extroverted people or conscientious people, right? And that's what we really care about. And so I came to positive psychology in 2004 when I started my graduate studies. It was a very young field. And I became interested in our field, though, was still kind of stuck in the old view, and we're still trying to secularize or take only the thing that's shared with everyone as we studied virtues. And what that meant, though, is that we were missing some of the key components. So, for example, when I looked at this initial handbook that was put out by Marty Seligman and Chris Peterson, they left out some really critical virtues, like patience, which has to do more with how you suffer something bigger than yourself. And a lot of the virtues that were being focused upon were really about self-help. And what are the things, these virtues that will make me happy, was often what was receiving the most attention. And it was, oh, be grateful, not because you have a moral duty to do so, but because this will make you happier and less depressed. And so in my work over the years, really trying to look at these virtues as the end in themselves, and that they are part of this rich meaning system. And a lot of the work is looking at Christianity in particular, and how to form a moral virtue, you need to get these good habits, which psychologists are fantastic at figuring out, like, what are the specific strategies and ways to become patient, and what are like things we can do and tweak in daily life. But that's not enough. We also need to say, what is the story a young person is telling about their life? And how are our contexts, in the university context in particular, what are the stories that we are implicitly or explicitly giving to young people? And how is that helping them as they learn these skills of open-mindedness, maybe as they are learning to be a scientist and the students I train? Are they actually going to apply that skill of open-mindedness, humility, to other contexts once they leave the classroom and once they're outside the laboratory? Right? And I think thinking about the R1 components too, like as they aim to really be researchers, is a lot of what our faculty are doing. Are they also good neighbors? Are they also good citizens? Perry Glanzer, my colleague, right, he talks about this a lot of we need some kind of meta identity, something that's can encompass all these domains of life. And religions, I think, offer some very compelling stories that we can offer to students. They're not the only ones. We have others out there in our culture, but they are very coherent and have spanned for centuries and millennia. And so my work is often looking at, take a virtue like patience as one very particular that was understudied. So people joke like, oh, Sarah's the world's expert because no one else studied it for well over a decade. And how do we think about when someone brings a religious narrative to suffering and making meaning of it, does that allow them to wait and suffer well? And what are the resources provided that kind of tradition that then come alongside the emotion regulation skills and the specific ways we can reappraise or learn to practice it in real life? But how do we need to have that framing that is bigger than the self and that concerns ultimacy and existential questions that's really connected to that kind of virtue, where it's about existential questions of why am I suffering and why do I have to wait and be a limited agent in this world? Those are hard. That kind of virtue is really hard to do without that bigger picture.
Sarah, there's lots of ways in which I could see suffering as, the university is a site for the exercise of the virtue of patience
Yes.
amid suffering. In terms of patience or any of the other virtues that you're looking at, can you parse out the sort of times in which you would see the university itself as institution as more than just the site for an exercise of virtue, as also a place in which students are already being inculcated within particular virtues?
Yeah, and I can speak to patience a little bit more. I think about the undergraduates in my research lab. Is a place where we work with them across years. I even have a former lab member, there he is in the audience, who's now a scholar in the lab. Students in their learning, and all of us, we can't move quickly to the truth or to coming across differences, and as we work towards justice and care of the world, that we can model and then also ourselves practice and help our students realize this is necessary virtue, that there aren't quick solutions. We can't, I say this with fear and trembling, but right, the Middle East conflict we are not going to quickly solve. That we need to have patience as well as courage alongside this. And I think we show this in the way we do our scholarship, and our students then get to enter in with us into that scholarly journey and recognize that it's taken some of these questions we're trying to answer at a university like University of Chicago or Baylor, that people have been working on these for millennia. To think we will instantly solve it, or even in our lifetimes, that academic program that we're all engaged in really requires that long view, which is hard when you're used to instant gratification and 5-second TikTok videos, and that is just so countercultural right now.
Thank you. John, returning to you, we've sort of shifted the conversation away from moral formation as religious formation to attention to virtue or character, thinking about the good or wise leader. We could think here about the good or the good doctor at UChicago, the good lawyer. And I guess I turn to you and ask, should the modern secular university be uninterested or neutral in terms of character formation? Is it more concerned with the excellent doctor or the good doctor? And we can move away from the doctor, but from your viewpoint as a sort of longstanding administrator at the university.
Yeah, so, one of the things that when I talk about our history and the history of the other big private universities in the States is to emphasize what happened in America, and it was happening in the UK, and it began happening in Germany earlier. A university is a very different animal than a college, and it's a much more complicated, not simply in running it and financing it and keeping it prestigious or successful, however you want to define success. But what happened at the big private schools, and also I would argue the top public land-grant schools, places like Michigan and Illinois and Berkeley, between about 1880 and 1910, is that a set of institutions that were primarily designed for students. The 19th century colleges were basically places to cultivate different kinds of student culture, but they were very student-oriented. That it's not, universities don't get rid of students, they need students, but after 1890, but this place and places like Stanford and Columbia become to define the university culture as the faculty culture, and the faculty culture becomes a kind of a hegemonic bundle of ways of being successful, ways of not becoming problematic and being fired, but being successful. It involves peer review, it involves productivity, it involves winning prizes, rankings come in. It's very, very it's really quite fascinating. It's one of the great revolutions that happens in American culture is the creation of these modern universities. Now, that doesn't mean that the students disappear, and at all of these big schools, and I think probably the smaller successful schools as well, you have almost a kind of an independent student culture emerging. Some of it you see in fraternities and sororities, some of it you see in athletic activities, some of it you see in study groups. I mean, there were a lot of kids on this campus in the 1950s reading Reinhold Niebuhr on evil, okay, because Niebuhr was a very fascinating person to be reading in the 1950s. They weren't required to do it. The fact they weren't telling you to do it, they were just doing it. I mean, you have these kind of intellectual fashions that were, I mean, our school was a little peculiar in the kind of density of intellectual intensity, but I think that was happening elsewhere as well. So you could imagine these conversations about virtue or about character building happening in all kinds of ways. And I think nowadays what we're seeing is because of the pressures of the market, in some ways commercial America, which is actually not only wants effective administrators but wants kind and successful administrators and so forth, is coming up with alternative patterns of character formation. And we see this in terms of preparing our students for interviews. If you go to be interviewed by, fill in the bank, how are you going to differentiate yourself from 17 other people who went to Wharton and to Harvard and to Oxford and whatever, to Baylor, to have a 4.0 in economics? Well, eventually your personality and your character do emerge in ways that may be surprising to both sides of the interview. And so in some ways you could argue that in some ways the the increasingly differentiated ecosystem of these universities allows for institutions like Lumen Christi and others at all these universities to do good work without, in a sense, declaring that this is the only way, or it has to be some kind of uniform way, because the universities are such, they're magnificent in their variety and in their kind of combativeness against being ruled. Great universities are unruly places. If they're not unruly, they're not a great university. And so it's hard to mandate any of these kinds of interventions, but at the same time, they're going to emerge. And as I said, all these stories about kids on this campus in the 50s reading Niebuhr. I don't know where they got the books from. There was they had to go to a real bookstore and buy it. But Niebuhr had something to say to them, and they wanted to have, and I'm sure there were other, books of similar acquaintance for other generations.
Sarah, it's interesting to hear John Boyer talk about the hegemony of the faculty at the university. And in our roundtable today, one of my interlocutors said, well, I don't know the students that much, a faculty interlocutor. Can you speak from your own research in terms of the different types of either exemplars or folks who are interfacing with students within the university context?
Yeah, no, and I mean, it's true. When we look at the moral influences on students within the university, and also spiritual as well, even at like a faith-based institution like Baylor, we find one of the primary influences they talk about are their peers, and that the communities where students are engaging, that is really influencing them. And we actually see of kind of the non-students, slightly older group, it's really staff at the institution. And things like coaches for sports teams, or like at Baylor, the resident chaplains. Some of these folks who are engaging outside of the classroom in these activities that students are electing to be a part of have real influence. Now, I think it is interesting, as we've done some analyses, different data sets we have, that faculty do have an influence. It's often alongside some other type of activity. And so I think there's some real truth to it that these other organizations around the university really do matter. Although I would say, though, as faculty in particular, we should not give up completely the fact that we need to engage in some character and moral formation. And I think in my own field, especially as we're thinking, maybe not even, it starts with the undergrad, but the graduate, some of the blatant moral failures of character, say amongst people who research honesty, that have gotten tons of public attention. In social psychology, it's alarming, or these misconduct or data falsification kind of incidents say, actually, we can't be forming our researchers without real attention to their character. It's not enough just to know the rules, or even to be an expert in honesty. You actually need to, as we conduct our research in labs and with our graduate students and postdocs, we need to actually be thinking about who are we forming, and is it really for success and production of outputs, or are we actually seeking other goals of actually knowing the truth and having formation of integrity, communal norms, gratitude, right? These things that it can't just be about meeting the metrics, because then we see massive failures of that. And I feel like every couple months in social psychology, you're like, oh, there's another one. So I feel it very acutely in my field, and public trust in our scholarship is vastly undermined, and undermines even the work that's done that is excellent. So.
And we're going to be turning to questions from the audience in just a minute after my next question. So do start preparing. Feel free to write them down. Someone will bring you a mic. But Jonathan, you serve this unique role of helping, direct students past the university, thinking beyond the virtues that will sustain them into their life. Would you just be willing to share a few of the central virtues that have been a central part of your project, and maybe a story from them that you'd be willing to share with us that are central for sharing for students beyond?
Yes, absolutely. And I think some of these that we started with, wouldn't neatly fit within the category of virtue, but certainly dispositions that we were interested in. So we started at the beginning with 4, and those were a sense of vocation, which was broadly conceived to not necessarily have to be a kind of a religious sense of, call, from God, from a deity, but could be, a sort of, other-centered, sense of call, if you like, maybe from a community or, the country that you come from, but a desire to give something back rather than just be self-focused. The second, very closely related, was a commitment to service. So, an attitude, again, of wanting to go beyond simply self-interested endeavors. And then 2 more sort of classical virtues were around gratitude and humility. And I think we were intentionally trying to pick virtues or dispositions, whatever language we might use, that we didn't think were, as it were, automatically is the wrong word, but were naturally inculcated by the university experience. They clearly, I think patience, as you were saying, Sarah, clearly is one. If you're writing a 60,000 word or 100,000 word thesis, or for that matter, waiting for feedback from the supervisor of your 100,000 word thesis, then patience is something I think that you kind of have to learn if you're going to thrive in that context. But some of these others we felt weren't so naturally inculcated within the process of studying as a graduate student. And I think, gratitude had a lot to do with this sense of, in our culture and society, the sort of myth of the self-made man or woman, wanting to always feel that you have, achieved on your own in these very elite institutions, I think, is very prevalent. And, gratitude, being very intentional about thinking, who has enabled me to be where I am, that isn't just my ability or my hard work, but obviously parents, sometimes siblings, friends that have supported me, teachers that have inspired me, those kinds of things. And then humility, some of that is intellectual humility, a willingness to engage with different viewpoints and to recognize that your own, belief systems or, values or whatever might not be ultimate or the best or the only ones. But also, that sense of having a clear-eyed view of yourself. So, neither putting yourself too low and thinking I have nothing to offer, nor putting yourself too high and thinking I'm the only solution to this problem. So those were some that we worked on, and we added in as we went, practical wisdom, prudence, just recognizing, as the entire tradition says, that is essential to deploying any of these virtues, and honesty, interestingly, which, is very highly valued.
Thank you. We're going to turn to the audience, though certainly I will invite a last word as we close from our panelists, if there's anything left. So if there's any questions, yes, please go ahead. Here.
I wrote a dissertation here years ago, and I've been thinking the last couple days, how did the University of Chicago morally form me? And the best answer I can come up with is the examples of my teachers, Brian Garish and Dan Garber, and their fierce expectations, and the care with which they taught me how to read a text, and that was a profoundly moral act. And so it's their example. Now I've had another career on Wall Street, and moral formation and intellectual formation works a little different on Wall Street, but I've never seen or experienced anything like the effect of Mr. Garish and Mr. Garber. So maybe you want to call that scholarly virtue, or maybe it's not moral formation. I don't know, but I haven't seen, and it's rare. I think it's a rare thing even in universities.
I think, knowing I never met those gentlemen, but I've heard about them, and I can well believe that. If you look at all universities, I'm sure Oxford and Baylor do, we have prizes, teaching prizes that are given. And usually the students have to write in, and they have to write a letter saying why their favorite teacher should get the teaching prize. We have one called the Quantrell Award. It's one of the oldest. And every year we get dozens of letters, and these are from kind of like humble undergraduates, not PhD students. And these were smart kids, but they were not experts in the field. And I would say 80 or 90% of the rhetoric or the discourse in those letters had to do with the way these professors were mentoring them as kind of young scholars, but also as kind of young intellectuals, young people who were looking for role models. And we could call that virtue or whatever. And it was very powerful. And so you say, like, well, were they really an effective calculus teacher? Well, yeah, I mean, they could teach calculus. That was important too. But it was really kind of looking up to them and taking an interest in their fate, interest in their life, knowing their names, knowing the names of their parents, knowing where they lived. I mean, these are all features of which helped create a strong and rich university culture. And it's easier to do on the doctoral level where you have a smaller number, you have these long runways of. But if you have a college of, Cornell or Penn of 10 or 11,000 undergraduates, how do you do that with the faculty? And increasingly, the numbers of faculty of the tenure ranks in the states and the UK is diminishing. You have more and more what are called contingent faculty. There's a story in the Harvard student newspaper this morning about they're doing union negotiations because the lecturers are being unionizing, and Harvard has a rule that after 3 or 6 years you're out. So, and the undergraduates are pleading to allow the university to keep these teachers because they're primarily teachers who probably are perceived by the undergraduates as having much deeper interest in their lives as persons than some famous Nobel Prize winner. We all have a lot of faculty like that too, and so and Harvard right now is resisting that. It's kind of like after 3 and 6 years you leave and then we'll find somebody else and give them a chance. Which that's an argument, equity that you can make in defense of that. So I think your point is very well taken, and it then speaks to basically what are we doing with these students? Are the faculty the faculty? Who are the faculty, first of all? Is it the iconic faculty, or is it basically part-time contingent faculty? And are they supported, and are they kind of taking an interest in the students and modeling behavior in the way you're articulating? Because I would venture to say that most undergraduates at most of these places do not have that kind of experience, if we're very candid.
I have a question also for Dean Boyer about the reference to the changes that I think Reuben attributed to the turn of the century being in place much earlier. You said 1860 or so. I've always thought of the Moral Act as a kind of significant development right around that time, which I think was 1862. But I'm curious if you could just unpack that a little bit more. I'm very curious in the history. Like, were these changes in place before 1860, or are you referring to the Moral Act? Was the Moral Act a significant independent variable in this process?
Yeah, the Moral Act being the creation of land-grant colleges and universities. In preparation for this panel, last night I reread there's a famous report that Yale produced in 1828. It's called the Yale Report of 1828. It's kind of a defense of the classical college mandated four-year curriculum for men, by the way, but although some of the women's colleges copied it. And then I read there's a very famous essay by Charles Eliot, who becomes president of Harvard in 1869, called The New University. And this is kind of a defense of what came to be called the elective system. And if you read those carefully, and again, this is through the image of, it's a very gendered image because they're talking about male colleges. It's kind of mental discipline and the cultivation of liberal virtue, liberal culture. And I think in the Yale report, moral is mentioned like twice, and I did a word search in the Eliot, I don't think he mentions it at all. I mean, it's really quite striking. Now, and these are reports not about research universities, these are reports about what come to be seen as the kind of iconic norm-setting colleges of the 19th century. So, and these were both denominational colleges. It doesn't mean that in many of these places there weren't students who were deeply religious in all kinds of ways, not simply church-going, but in the context of their personal lives. But the argument that seems to be emerging by studying the student culture as opposed to the kind of ideas of the faculty is that even among these small colleges, the student culture was becoming much more differentiated, part-time students, older students. A student who's 18 and a student who's 34 have very different purchase on life in terms of what they're trying to accomplish at their college. And so in a way, when the research universities come to be these big behemoths of talent and merit and prestige, you already have a student culture that's so differentiated that it can kind of fit into them, because you could argue, well, where are they getting the students who can play that game? Well, in some ways, the students, Geiger and others would argue they're already playing that game in their small colleges in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. It's a very complicated thing. I don't mean to close down the possibility that there were not many devout people who were interested in real religious denominationalism, but certainly our own experience, most of the students who went to our first University of Chicago, that's not why they came to this place. You had Baptist seminaries, the families who were Baptist, they came to get skills and to get employability. I mean, we know that from studying their autobiographies.
Thank you. This was very interesting, and I'm not directing the question at a specific person, but I did find it interesting that the virtue ethics and character formation are capturing the interest of not just Christians or people with an explicit faith background, but people who do not identify with a faith. And to me, that seems like a tremendous opportunity, and it's very hopeful. And I wondered if, I'm sorry, I forget your name, but in
Sarah.
The British man?
Jonathan.
Jonathan or others, if in your experience, but you were talking about the program that garnered so much enthusiasm beyond what you expected. If when you present some of the background of these ideas, these traditions in Christianity, if that then leads to a receptivity to and an interest in Christian faith and exploring that, or if that's typically kind of separate.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And as I say, the entire program was born out of a Christian chaplaincy. We made the decision very early that we wanted to open it up, but we wanted it to be a genuine gift, as it were. We didn't want to have any implicit kind of quid pro quo that, if you take this program, you're going to have to listen to us talk about Christianity or whatever. And so it was very, very much something that we wanted to give away, and we felt that the resources were there in the tradition to be able to do that, that we could talk about all of these things without having to talk about Christianity. So that was, if you like, at the institutional, the program level, that was absolutely the decision. However, obviously, I worked on that program for certainly 9 years, and anybody who got to know me at all or Googled me or had any reason to read my bio would realize that actually, alongside running this program, I'm ordained, I'm a priest, a minister in the Church of England, I'm a chaplain. And so at that stage, then the conversation many, many, many times would shift completely, and all they would want to talk about was, my faith, why are you doing this, what motivates you, and talk to me about their values and either how they had rejected faith or were still considering it or whatever. So those conversations absolutely happened, and at a personal level, I would absolutely consider that one of the joys of having been in that program. But I think, in a sense, they only happened because the trust was there, because they knew that wasn't our hidden subterranean motive, that we were genuinely saying, we want to offer this to you because we think you are worth investing in, and this program potentially could help you. So thank you, that's a great question.
Final question from David.
I'll try to keep it brief. I wanted to repeat a version of the question that my colleague just asked. As a lot of us know, in the 20th century, one of the big voices for this new Aristotelian movement is Alistair MacIntyre. And I think a lot about his Gifford lectures, where he makes the case that there are 3 rival versions of moral inquiry that he sees, that the universities can take up as a kind of method. One he calls encyclopedism, which is sort of a positive total knowledge, which he thinks is kind of out of date and discredited. It goes back to the Enlightenment. And the 2 main rivals that he looks at the end are a Nietzschean genealogy, which has had tremendous influence in the universities, as we all know, or tradition to communicate about the virtues. And it strikes me that this new approach to thinking about virtues and character is trying something different in a disciplinary model, because it's looking to positive psychology and even educational theory to try to talk about the virtues without tradition. Do you think, what do you think are the prospects of that as a kind of new attempt to talk about virtue but without tradition, if I'm characterizing that in a way that you would agree with.
I can take a first stab. I think, so I have opinions, and then I also am like, what do the data say is often where I am, that's my love. And so I think it's a dangerous thing. So I know when I'm talking to students, I often, or colleagues maybe who have left religion or things of that sort, I think it's really good to connect to a tradition. Even if in some settings, right, I'm not going to say which one, but the danger, I think, so there's quite a few studies that have now started to accrue, right, a traditional religious practice that's become highly secularized and westernized is Buddhist meditation, for example. And right, a lot of it was mixed up with positive psychology, and we took this tradition, this particular practice, but stripped it away from its tradition and the meaning system that was connected to it and the communal aspect. And so we have recent studies in the last few years, several keep emerging, that when people are practicing mindfulness meditation in the US that's really been secularized, it actually increases self-focus and it actually has perhaps the opposite effect of like just increasing that self-enhancement, maybe narcissism kind of thing that we've already got going on, which is the opposite, yeah, let's call it a thing, of what I think that practice does when actually practiced within its tradition, that has all these other components that actually make it a practice that promotes morality and pro-sociality. And so I know as a researcher, and I feel like I'm almost often an evangelist to my colleagues, that you can't just strip the tradition away. And that when we conduct research on some of these practices that have developed over millennia within contexts, we need to just not pull these out of these traditions and then slap it out there as positive psychologists and be like, here's a practice that works really well, because it needs to be connected to the meaning system. And so I think one thing I try to think about, though, is, well, how do we then help people who have left religion? And what would be the key ingredients? We can't just take the practice and run with it, like done with mindfulness meditation. What are the other features of the narratives that people need to construct in maybe in new groups or new ways, but it's actually very dangerous perhaps without those. And I don't have great solutions for people who are not wanting to engage traditional religions, but just putting out a beacon to my colleagues of this was actually an essential element. And so we can't just we actually might do more harm than good. So that I know is something I'm very concerned about. And a lot of my research is saying actually the religious spiritual aspect, the connection to something bigger than yourself, the deity, a community, is really an essential ingredient. And we are doing harm potentially by not addressing that.
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't invite us all to practice certain virtues today. First, I want to extend gratitude to the Templeton Foundation that is helping to sponsor this, and our partners at Baylor with the DC3 grant. But also, I'd like to invite you to join me in gratitude of putting your hands together to thank our panel.